and what changes they wanted to effect. The other thing I need to make a correction to, and it's to my dear friend here sitting beside me. I think he mentioned 1 million of us. Perhaps he can tell me where I'm going wrong, but the Jews talked about 6 million of them suffering the Holocaust. I'm here to tell you that it was over 240 million of us who went through that kind of problem. So you're now dealing with 40 times the amount of problems that the Jews have, and we are still going through it now. The other thing I want to talk about is racism. A youngster said we should stop fighting among ourselves. While I agree with that to some extent, I also disagree, because brothers fight. And when brothers and sisters fight, you certainly do not call that racism. You call that a family struggle, whatever other name you want to put on it. But you do not term it in with the same terminology as when one group who considers themselves superior comes and not only takes advantage of you, but continues to reap the benefits of the advantage that their forebears have taken. Now, I would suggest that there's a book that comes to mind, and it's called, we call it Genocide. It's a very difficult book to read, but those of you who've got the stomach for it should try it. And then you get some kind of picture on how many people lost their lives, how many mothers killed their children because they did not want them to go through that kind of problem that they were going through. And the last thing I want to speak on at this particular point is reparation. Now, when it suits the planter class for the most part, and those of us who've been educated, and I use that term reservedly, educated in the European system, we talk about the ancient African systems having slaves. And nobody points out that that type of slavery was not by any means, could never be categorized in with the same terminology as a chattel slavery that my ancestors went through.
Gentleman next to you has a comment he wants to make.
Actually, it's a question. My question is, we've established that the two main problems with blacks not progressing today come from the psychological effects of slavery and then the lingering effects that are imposed on us from outside. My question to the panel is, which of the two, let's call them the self-imposed and the external, which of the two problems do you see as of greater concern, or that we should try to address most quickly? Or do you see that the mixture of the two must be confronted?
Perhaps you'd like to answer this, Dr. Watson.
In my view, I think the psychological considerations are the most important to be addressed. And I always recommend this book for anybody who is interested in developing their self-consciousness. It's a classic written by Rex Nettleford called Mirror, Mirror. And in a nutshell, for those of you who've never read this book or heard of it, it portrays a woman, a black woman, who looks at herself in a mirror, is dissatisfied with the image that stares back at her and wants to transform herself into a white woman. She isn't happy with herself. It's, if you like, the Michael Jackson syndrome. Alright? Now, lots of us are not happy with the way we look. That's why many of us who can afford it patronize plastic surgeons, etc. But I think that black people in particular, who for a long period of time and from generation to generation have been socialized to believe things like you have bad hair. Well, nowadays you don't hear so much about bad hair. When I was growing up as a child in Barbados, I was socialized into what was good hair and what was bad hair. Hair is hair. But if you have what society regards as bad hair, you're going to have a negative self-image. Your self-esteem is going to be low. So therefore, unless you overcome these hurdles, then your sense of self-worth, your sense of identity, and hence the way you project yourself to your fellow human beings is going to be affected.
Okay.
So unless you overcome these hurdles, life will be difficult for you. And if you look at this collectively, then you can see that I think the psychological aspects are the most important for black people to overcome.
I would like to leave that answer there. See, we do have a problem with our self-image coming out of our experience of slavery. If we were left to our own devices, we probably would have repaired that psychological damage by now. But we have an additional problem. We have a system, an international system of white supremacy that was founded, that was based on the slave trade and the system of slavery that is very much in existence today, that continues to carry out warfare against the people of Africa and African ancestry. And therefore, this is why my friend here speaks about Mr. Nehelfer's book. I would refer you to Marcus Garvey's book and Marcus Garvey's doctrine of Pan-Africanism and African nationalism, because the only way we are going to combat those two evils is if we unite as an African people, understand that we face a common threat collectively, and come together and develop our own power, our own strength, develop black power.
Many people believe that emancipation came about due to certain factors, economic, political, and humanitarian mainly. I personally believe that slave revolts are an underplayed but important catalyst in emancipation. There were others such as the Berbice and Bussa and the Christmas Rebellion, and I believe that especially the Christmas Rebellion in 1831, that was a crucial catalyst. I would like to know if you agree with that perspective, and why is the role of the slave revolts underplayed?
Well, I definitely agree. In fact, Earl Stanley, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, when he piloted the Emancipation Bill in the House of Commons, this is exactly what he said. He said, if we do not, I'm summarizing him, if we do not abolish slavery by legislative means, the black slaves of the Caribbean are going to do it for us by revolutionary means. Governor Lord Commonwealth, the governor of Barbados, wrote to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, telling him that the white planter population of Barbados lived in the 18-teens under the fear of a black insurrection. So there is no doubt that the constant slave rebellions, and Michael Cratton in his book Testing the Chains, he counted 75 slave rebellions in the British Caribbean alone between 1638 and 1838. In the United States, some 250 either slave plots or rebellions were counted. And so there can be no doubt whatsoever that the slave rebellions were a primary factor in the passage of the Emancipation Act. Of course, it served the interests of the British colonialists rather than giving the credit to the black slaves for emancipating themselves, to claim that it was an act of British charity and humanitarianism. So it served their interest to emphasize the role played by the abolitionists and so forth. Our ancestors played the dominant role. People always liberate themselves. They can get help from outside, but fundamentally, people liberate themselves.
Let me speak to this young lady first of all and correct misapprehension that she's under. Recent West Indian historiography written by West Indians has certainly addressed the issue that you alluded to of the participation of slaves in liberating themselves. In fact, all recent West Indian writings on the period of slavery and emancipation over the last 20 years have seriously addressed this issue and have done it scholastically, rigorously, and you can, apart from Michael Creighton, you can cite Professor Beckles, Barry Higman, Vereen Shepherd, myself, and a number of people have written on what Professor Beckles refers to as the self-liberation ethos of slaves. In fact, so much so that now we professional historians have said, hey, let's reconsider the humanitarians and see, because for a long time they have been put on the back burner. And now very recent historiography is again looking at the so-called humanitarian group and their role in emancipation. Which leads me to the second point that Trevor wanted me to refer to. And let me expose, I think, all of Barbados for the first time to two white Barbadians who played very crucial roles in the emancipation movement. And these are the lawyer John Alleyne from the famous oldest elite white family on Barbados. Not John Gay Alleyne, no, a cousin of his, John Alleyne. John Alleyne was a trained lawyer who argued at the bar, and he argued in all of the major cases which established the jurisprudence which eventually created the foundation on which the Emancipation Act came about. The Mansfield Act, which is regarded as a cornerstone in emancipation. The lawyer who argued that, it was Judge Mansfield who gave the decision, but the lawyer who argued that was a white Barbadian lawyer by the name of John Alleyne. And his views on slavery are amazing for a person who was descended from the planter class. Also, another individual, Reverend Nichols, Dean of Midland, who also lived in Barbados for 7 years and organized pro-slave, pro-emancipation movements here among the white Barbadian population. All of the major tracts that were written by the humanitarian movement, which publicized the horrors of slavery, which put forward the views of black people who did not have the avenues to put forward the views in England, all of this was orchestrated and written and done by a white Barbadian, the Reverend Nichols. The two of these individuals need to be looked at very carefully. And Reverend Nichols, when he came to Barbados, he organized a small group of white Barbadian women who visited plantations, who acted as pro-emancipators. We suffer from a syndrome, and this is the rich white syndrome and the poor black syndrome. But things in life are not that clear-cut. And let me say this, I'll get back to the point that Trevor alluded to very briefly. One of the groups, in fact I'm writing an article now on them, one of the groups that suffered most from emancipation was the militia tenants, the poor white group who were thrown off the plantations. And in fact, the documents show that hundreds of white young children and elderly white men and women died of starvation after emancipation. Slavery was first and foremost an economic phenomenon. And since these whites no longer had a role to play as controllers of slaves, they were dispersed and dispensed with. They were booted out. And this wasn't kith or kin. These were whites throwing out other whites because they were no longer of use to them. This is one of the hard realities of life. So when we talk about whites being defensive of other whites and so on, look at the Irish in Ireland, the whites killing other whites. I mean, hatred among peoples, I think, is not exclusive to skin coloring and phenotype. Because why do blonde people turn around and kill other blonde people? It's a question of humanity. And the final point I want to make is that genetically, there is no evidence, there is no medical evidence to subgroup the human population into races. Otherwise, black and whites could not marry or come together sexually and have children. We share all genes together. And I would argue that many black Barbadians share European ancestry, and many so-called white Barbadians share African or black ancestry.
Okay, we'll go now to the audience.
I'd just like to make a very quick point, almost pertaining to what Dr. Watson just said, pertaining to this whole concept that black people need to come together and unite. We always hear people saying that black people need to unite, black people are stupid because we are still fighting each other. But the fact is that human beings do not spontaneously decide one day to unite. Human history is a history of fighting, of wars, of power struggles, of trying to dominate each other, and black people are no different from any other human cultures. Now granted, slavery may have had, in fact slavery did have a part to play in how we are right now, how we tend to divide ourselves among black people, and lighter skinned black people may think that they're better than darker skinned black people. The fact remains that human nature is such that we are not going to decide tomorrow, let us unite, let us come together. It is only when black people realize, or any people for that matter, any culture realizes that there is a clear and present danger, a threat to their existence, that they decide to unite. In countries where white people make up the majority population, white people kill each other because there is no need to unite. However, from the time they move into a country where they are in the minority and where their existence becomes threatened, then they decide to unite. Same thing with black people in Barbados. We are majority population. Well, you could say that we have the political power, and henceforth many of us do not see a danger to our existence. Many of us don't see a danger to our development as a people. It is only when we believe that there is one, it's only when we acknowledge that there are structures and individuals out there in place whose purpose is to prevent us from moving forward that we will decide, okay, the time has come for us to put aside the warring among each other and unite.
Another comment from the audience?
Just to respond to that. In 1885, all of the major nation states of Europe that had squabbled between themselves for centuries sat down around the table in Berlin at the Berlin Conference and decided that they were going to carve up the continent of Africa among themselves. And they were going to do it in a cooperative manner. They were not going to fight over it. Germany would take this part, and France would take that part, and Portugal that part. And they implemented it. And they carved up the continent of Africa, took their colonies, and put in place a system of imperialist domination that is still in place in its fundamental structures today. Black people were able to fight back against some of those impositions through the Pan-African movement. The Pan-African movement was a movement for bringing black people together, for recognizing that they had a common cause and a common struggle, and that they needed to struggle collectively. One of the most important Pan-Africanist gatherings was the 1945 Manchester Conference, when people like Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah and George Padmore and CLR James were able to bring together black forces, and they were able to come together with a common program and go back out to the African continent and to the other black colonies to engage in a common struggle. That common struggle ultimately led to the formal political independence of many African colonies. So the lesson is that when black people have made progress is precisely when they have made an attempt to unify, to come together, to recognize that they do face common enemies and common challenges, and to come up with a common strategy to deal with it.
Okay, we'll go now to the audience for another question.
I'd also like to add to what Mr. Commission just said, that black people will also unite when they stop putting down each other. The gentleman on the right made a comment that when blacks, that he would like to see blacks stop fighting against blacks. And I think Mr. Marshall misunderstood what he meant. He did not mean racism. He meant as in, like, if you see a black youth walking down the road, and then there would be another black person in a house, and they would say, well, he has on baggy pants, he has on a trench coat, that sort of stuff, he's got to be in drugs, something like that. And I don't think that the young man on the right meant slavery. I just think he meant putting down each other, discrimination.
Okay, another question from the audience.
I'm addressing this question to Mr. Commissioner. Do you consider the celebration of emancipation significant to our national development?
Of course. A nation is built on a sense of historical continuity. You cannot build a nation if you have no sense of history, that you have come from somewhere, that as a people you have gone through a common struggle and have common achievements. And therefore, if we are serious about building a nation in Barbados, we have to expose our people to our history. We have to root that nation in our historical experience as a people. And we have to go back and focus on the brightest and the best in our historical experience. It's not everything in our historical experience that is good, but certainly emancipation and the struggle that black people went through to achieve that Emancipation Act constitutes part of the brightest and best in our historical tradition. We need to focus on it. We need to draw inspiration from it.
Okay, Mr. Marshall wanted to make a comment.
Yes, black people were emancipated in Barbados in 1838. But there are certain things which continue. For example, child labor. None of us today has spoken about that. Child labor bespattered the history of Barbados from the 1830s until the 1930s, and none of those children who worked in the cane fields from age 8, none of them was white or colored, whether poor, well, perhaps poor white, because Carol has a serious point about poor whites, and I agree that their problem is a serious one in Barbados as well. But for the sheer bulk of persons who suffered after emancipation, that is minimal. I think each of us here has some grandparent who worked in the cane fields as a person under 10, which meant that our education was stunted. Perhaps our physical growth was stunted too. And that's one of the things we have to look at. And perhaps we need to look at what our society did in terms of the struggle of black people after 1838 rather than focus on emancipation. Because in doing so, we're apt to romanticize what happened. There was a long, hard struggle after 1838. One has to look at the riots which some colleagues like Henderson Carter have shown. Throughout the 1850s and 60s, black people in Barbados struggled. They burnt canes, they dug up cane fields, they engaged in strikes. The strikes which our people are engaging in nowadays has that long tradition going back to the 1830s. No mention has been made of the Masters and Servants Act, but that Masters and Servants Act bound black people in Barbados, including my family, to a small little hut on a plantation land, and you could not move away from that hut. You couldn't work anywhere else. You couldn't even migrate. And we romanticize that experience by building affluent cottages nowadays and calling them chattel huts. A chattel hut in Barbados was as small as the area of those children sitting over there, and 11 or 12 people lived in them. I've seen chattel houses. Emancipation doomed our people to this kind of existence. Emancipation meant too that in 1854, 20,000 black people died in the cholera epidemic in 2 weeks' time. In 2 weeks. All of these things happened as a result of emancipation because a grasping white planter class, not totally all whites, not middle class or poor whites, but a grasping white planter class reimposed their control on the land. And we haven't touched the Barbadian church. The Anglican church in Barbados always boasts that it helped the slave, it helped them down. No black person was made a priest in Barbados from 1838 to about the 1930s. The Anglican church was as racist as the white planter class in Barbados, and that is incontrovertible. It's not only a matter of seating, putting blacks in the back and up in the galleries, but the Anglican church made sure that racism, pure and simple, came into being when slavery ended. And these are things we have to look at when we look at emancipation, not just the glory of that day or the glory of the concept. And I think that historians should take the lead in showing us the long, hard struggle that had to do. This is why I'm still ambivalent about the walks and the commemoration of Bussa, because when that Bussa statue was established in 1985, and when I, working with the Cultural Foundation, chose those inscriptions for the Bussa Foundation, people asked, why you want that dirty, ugly black nigger up there for people to see? And people thought it was divisive, etc. Therefore, I'm not sure that Barbadians have yet come to terms with history of slavery or emancipation. And with all due respect to David and the Clement Payne movement, etc., I have strong, very serious ambivalence about emancipation.
Okay, Trevor, we'll go on yet another question.
Yes, I must say that this discussion is very encouraging and helpful. My question is to Mr. Watson. I would like to ask, given the lot of talk about Emancipation Day, and some people trying to trivialize it, and recognizing that whites did suffer, there were whites also who were actually transplanted into Australia, prisoners, right, as slaves and so on. And in Barbados they suffered as well. Don't you think that Emancipation Day is a day that should be actually be recognized by all races of Barbados, seeing everybody suffered, right? And secondly, don't you think that given the antagonistic and true love the Americans to Barbados and the Caribbean as a whole about recognizing Haiti and Cuba. Don't you think that this emancipation period and so on should pull the Caribbean people together and encourage them to go on to unite with their brothers?
Very quick response, Mr. Watson?
Yes, two responses because there are two questions. First of all, yes, we've been addressing emancipation. Let's not forget that emancipation emancipated whites as well. I have a very interesting letter written in 1760. A white Barbadian who was educated in England came back here. He tried to come out of Barbados on 3 occasions and left each time. And know what he wrote in his final letter? He couldn't live here because of slavery. And he said, slavery debases the master as well as the slave. And in his view, it debases the master more than it debases the slave. And he couldn't live in this society. So he left. U.S. Caribbean relations. I've always thought that the United States has been very short-sighted in the way they view and deal with the Caribbean, and particularly their hang-ups over Cuba, which are, I might say, are largely directed by highly articulate and powerful small American Cuban population. Many of the present acts, Helms-Burton, etc., have been articulated and instigated by this powerful exiled Cuban community, who are desirous of grinding Cuba into the dust so that Castro falls and Cuba reopens, so that they can come back in with capital to develop Cuba as they see fit. And the State Department, to some degree, has bought their line, and so is trying to pressure us in terms of development of our foreign policy. It's heartening to see that not only Barbados but Jamaica has taken the lead in re-establishing August the 1st as a major celebration of Emancipation Day. And let me get back to Trevor's comment. 1834 made a substantial legal change, and David, as a lawyer, he can tell you, there is a substantial change between being non-free and being free. Irrespective of all of the difficulties put in the path of black people after emancipation, they were free, and there is a vast, vast difference there, and I think it denigrates and nullifies emancipation to say that nothing changed after 1834. There was a massive change. It did not go as deep as it ought to have, yes. And I would argue, and I believe, that if the British government had foresight, they would have set up a fund to educate ex-slaves and to rehabilitate ex-slaves and to bring them forward and create a society. And this is very short thinking. A lack of thinking, lack of foresight on the part of the British government. Yes, I would argue and agree with you strongly on this point. But 1834 changed a lot.
Okay.
I would like to say, as a young man, right, all you have been discussing here is the past, right? We deal with the future, okay? As a young man, I would like to reach the peak of my spiritual consciousness. I would like to know what I'm about, because if I don't know what I'm about, I can't know what the Lord is about. That is what needs to be done. You all need, okay, we must respect the past, we must get clarified, but remember this, the Lord and us on the earth to be fighting more physical this or that. You're supposed to be spiritually, okay? Everybody nowadays is a material thing, material world. I would like to make that point and tell you all to please stop dealing with the past. You all are historians, right? But we come on this about emancipation, but presently, if we're emancipated or not in this time, thank you very much for making me make that point.
But as they say, if you don't know your past, you don't know your future. So it still has significance for all of us. The question now lies in, will there be reparations for us as a black race? Will we ever unite as one people? Are we feeling emancipated within ourselves? And that's a question only you can answer. Thanks for watching TP Parks. I'm Wendy Burke.
Tomorrow's people. Tomorrow's people. Take part. Tomorrow's people.
There's racism in the educational system, but it's not only the educational system, it's what you learn at home.
There we're having a lot of teenagers becoming pregnant, unable to support their children. Besides, some of them are way older.
I feel those men should be put behind bars.
We do have a culture already. I think we choose not to acknowledge it.
If you didn't get a chance to voice your views, join us on TP Parked this summer vacation. Youth groups, summer camps, in fact, all young people. It's your time to talk. Call us at 429-2041, extensions 4173 or 4174 to book your seats.